Werthan by Darran Jordan. He could feel the tendrils of the jungle coiling about his ankles, tugging at him as he ran. The branches swept at his face sharp and hard, slicing away at his flesh like scalpels as he forced his way onward through the pain. Only the terror kept him going, the constant sickening knowledge that they were right behind him, jaws snapping at the air where he had stood only moments before. He imagined the foul beasts rending and tearing at the air as if eating his shadow, a grim appetizer before the main course. He didn't know how much longer he could continue like this, his legs jelly-like with fatigue, his lungs searing with the effort of pushing oxygen in and out of his exhausted frame. It felt like he had been running forever, and he feared there would never be respite. Only the fear, only the pain, only the endless terror of being hunted. It was as he thought this that he finally broke free from the jungle and tumbled down the slope towards an open marshland beyond. The sun was little more than an opaque watermark in the dirty grey sky above. Ahead, stretching on forever, the bubbling grey-brown broth of muddy marsh water stretched seemingly forever. There was nowhere to hide out there, no shelter and no hope of escape. They were coming, so close behind him, always following, ready to kill. He had no choice. He had to go on. Plunging forward into the wet ruin, he soon found its viscid anguish flowing his every footstep, urging him with every moment to stop his struggles and give in. And he wanted to. Oh, how he wanted to be done with all of this. But the terror kept him moving, struggling on through his despair, tears of frustration staining his cheeks as he forced a path forward, too afraid to look behind. For a time he seemed to forget everything apart from the fear and the need to move. He kept putting one foot in front of another, while behind him he knew they were closing fast. The vast, slavering pack was wading through the marshlands with him, their hunger forcing them on just as his terror motivated him. He could hear the loud sloshing of his own feet, but it was not enough to drown out that more distant sound of splashing paws, the wet footfalls of his unrelenting pursuers. His own beating heart was pounding like a drum, and his ragged breath echoed around and around through his mind. But more than anything, it was the sound of their eager panting that consumed the small space left in his mind for thought. They would never stop. Neither could he. But he could not run forever. The marsh stretched on endlessly, just as the jungle had before, and the desert before that, and the snow before that, and the rocks before that, and the hot obsidian of the volcanic plains before that. And never anywhere was there any respite, only the endless running. "Hello," a rich, mellifluous voice spoke directly into his ear. "Would you care for a jelly baby?" The man was so surprised his feet stopped moving altogether, and he tumbled face forward into the marsh, his body finally giving up, the momentum that had carried him this far crashing into collapse. "The wolves," he croaked, turning in the mud to stare backward at his hunters. "The pack." "Oh, I wouldn't worry about them," the man smiled, wide eyes punctuating his manic, toothy grin. From the depths of his pocket he produced an object like a metal rod with a circular section affixed to the top, its centre red like a bullseye. With a flourish the stranger activated this device, and a high-pitched whine issued from it. In the area it pointed towards, the marshland suddenly exploded in a jet of fire. With a deep and hearty chuckle the man spun in an arc, and the fire spread in time with his movement, coalescing like a drawn curtain across a theatre stage. It spread seamlessly until it formed a perfect circle about the pair. It was nothing less than a protective wall of flame, with the two men at its centre, protected on their island of mud by the crackling ring of fire. On the other side of the red heat the dogs snarled and barked in fury at their prey's impossible escape. Still trying to catch his breath, the hunted man looked up from the ground toward his saviour, who seemed to be the most unusual person he had ever encountered. He wore a mass of curled brown hair atop his head, body wrapped in a long coat of deep maroon, juxtaposed with an impossibly long scarf of endlessly varying patches, wrapping around and around him like an encircling serpent. Somehow he contrived to have no mud on him whatsoever, despite the inhospitable surrounds. The stranger returned the metal rod to his pocket, and in its stead withdrew a small white paper bag, crumpled about its edges. "So," he smiled, "how about that jelly baby?" The exhausted runner reached into the bag and drew forth a brightly coloured sugar confectionery. Without pausing to consider what he was doing, he placed it in his mouth and closed his lips around it. Instantly his taste buds came alive. It was without question the most delicious thing he had ever eaten. But then he could not remember when he might have eaten last. For the longest time all he had known was the fear and the need to run. He relished this moment of sanctuary, this impossible place of rest and sustenance. He had thought he would never know the like of such again, and was so grateful to this stranger for providing them he could barely speak. As he swallowed down the jelly baby, he tried to struggle up from the mud, but his exhausted body refused to obey his commands. He had already asked too much of his weakened frame and was forced to admit defeat, slumping back to the ground once more. The stranger seemed to understand his intent, however, kneeling beside him and placing a consoling hand on his shoulder. "Take it easy," he cautioned. "There's no rush. You're safe now." "Safe? Why don't you just rest for a time? Don't worry. I'll watch over you." The man managed a brief, exhausted smile of thanks before his body finally gave in to the fatigue washing over him, and he slumped back into the mud, senseless in sleep. For a long time the stranger in the scarf stood over him, watching on with concern. Then he turned his attention back to their surroundings, to the grey skies and the wet marsh and the crackling flames and the snarling predators that still waited beyond the curtain of fire. "Oh no," he frowned with concern. "No, this simply won't do at all." With a flourish he waved his hands and everything vanished. The entire world blinked out of existence and was instantly replaced with an endless, featureless white. The colourful stranger then rubbed his hands together with glee, smiling in anticipation of what would come next. "Ah," he exclaimed, "as I once said to my good friend Leonardo, there's nothing more beautiful than a blank canvas." And his hands moved with swift and delicate motion, and reality reshaped itself around him, growing in colour and life as the world took on its new form. The doctor pulled the electrodes away from his temples and let them fall, not even caring to watch as they tumbled haphazardly to the floor. He rose slowly, surprised to find that he was more exhausted than he had expected. He chose to swing his feet idly back and forth off the edge of the metal slab, clicking his heels together once, twice, then 3 times, before he finally shifted his weight forward and stood up once more. "Well, it's no Sistine Chapel," he muttered to himself, "but it'll do." Beside and below him he heard the sound of servo motors grinding, and a familiar shape rolled into view. The grey metal box was shaped for whimsy, designed with a ridiculous human affectation in mind, one that always made him smile. "Artificial gravity field and a negative magma field repaired. Dark matter scoop upgraded. Sigma-style warp engines online. All systems functioning normally again, Master," the robot dog reported, wagging his tail as he did so. "Good boy, Canine," the doctor enthused in response, patting his electronic pet upon the head, causing the dog to wag his tail even faster still. "How fared the ship's crew, Master?" Canine asked, his tail ceasing its movements as he saw the expression change on the doctor's face in response to his words. Like a continent shifting, the doctor's moods were vast and implacable. His seemingly endless supply of mirth quenched in an instant, his smile curving instead into a deeply etched frown. "Well," he replied, "I did what I could. From out of all those suspended animation capsules, only one crew member had survived. This ship has been adrift a long time. A very, very long time." "Has the remaining crew member been safely revived?" the dog asked, with perhaps a touch of anxiety creeping into its electronic voice, sensors ever alert to his master's emotions. "No," the doctor replied, his head hung low in deep despondency. He'd been asleep for too long. He would never survive the resuscitation protocols. The sleeper will never wake. so I did the only thing I could for him. I settled his nightmares, and I gave him pleasant dreams. There was nothing further to say. They had done what they could, little enough though it was. It was time to move on again now. Time to leave this ghost ship to its lost meanderings. There was no telling where it might end up, this rudderless craft, adrift in an inky black sea. But none of that was their concern. They were just travellers, passing through, never stopping long enough to witness the consequences of their actions. There was never enough time for that. There were too many other places to see, too many other people to meet, and far, far too many other adventures to have. Moments later there was a wheezing, groaning sound as a blue box faded from existence, leaving only silence and slumber in its wake. When the man awoke, it was not the marsh and the hunt, but rather to peace and serenity. He looked about himself in wonder, catching his breath at the sight of the vast garden around him. Every tree hung laden with ripe fruit, the scent of blossom and berry intoxicating in the air around him. His mud-soaked and torn garments had been replaced by a clean white shift, as soft and comfortable as the grass he lay nestled in, softer than any bed he could imagine. Smiling, the man stood and began to wander through the elegance of his garden, delighting in its perfection, as though it had been crafted by some beneficent god especially for him. He vaguely remembered a man, strangely dressed, wearing a face full of compassion and genius. Within the garden, inside the sleep capsule, aboard the desolate spacecraft, the man dreamed briefly of the doctor and offered him his thanks. He had restored Eden for him, had brought him at last to perfection, peace, and rest. Somewhere in space, the SS Marie Antoinette drifted aimlessly through the dark, while its last remaining crew member slept on, nestled in a bed of cables and wires. He dreamed of a grove of wonder and serenity, his sleeping thoughts caressed with images of the ultimate paradise, promised land. And in the dark, the ship dreamed that endless dream with him as it sailed silently on, gliding through the endless dark, guided by dreams of the light toward its uncertain future.
You have been listening to Werthan, a short story by Darran Jordan. The story was read by Darran Jordan. The music and technical production was by Roger Reynolds. This has been a DR Productions project, and we hope that you have enjoyed it and have been entertained.